Hey, this is David Heinrich Hansen. This is episode 3 of On Writing Software Well. Today I'm going to talk about Current, which is a new feature in Rails 5.1 that we've been using in Basecamp for a long time. We only just extracted it into Rails 5.1 after I actually saw a bunch of discussions around globals, not just in Ruby on Rails, but in other communities, and how, as we all know, globals are considered harmful, right? Not so fast. I think globals have a great place in all sorts of applications, and especially in web applications, since a lot of these, all of these, operate within a request cycle where there are just certain things that you set up at the start of the request that you really would like to have easy access to throughout the request, and that's really sort of the whole life cycle of the application. And using globals for these things is a wonderfully good fit. Of course, you can go crazy and you can start using globals everywhere or too many of them, and it can turn into a big mess. But just because something can turn into a big mess does not mean that it's not something we want to use when it's the right fit. In Ruby on Rails, we have this idea of providing sharp knives, that it's not a sin of a framework or a language to provide you with really sharp knives that could cut your hand off if you use them wrong, but they can also provide just the incision that you need, the precision that you need to make something happen in an easy and readable way. So that's kind of how I feel about globals, but let's take a look at how we use globals through Current in Basecamp. So this is the Current class that we have in Basecamp. As I said, this was actually something we've been using for many years, since the inception of Basecamp 3 in this code base, but it was only recently that I extracted it out into something that now lives in Ruby on Rails. It's really a short little class. It doesn't do that much. It's really just dedicated to declaring a handful of attributes that you want to be available through this Current class, which is basically our word for globals in this context, and then providing you with a way of delegating to these setups and a hook for what should happen when you want to reset the current after a request is over. And as you can see here, we really just have two main classes of things that we set as current. We have the current account, which we derive from the URL. Basecamp 3 uses the account ID as part of the path. We take that out in a piece of middleware and stick it into, or do a lookup and set that lookup to current account. The one I want to focus on a little more today is current person. Current person is what's being set when you log in, either explicitly through a form or through OAuth or through a cookie or through any of these other means of authentication that we have. And then secondarily, we have the request details that are set as part of a callback in the application controller, or concern through the application controller. And as you can see, we do a couple of things when we set this current person here. If the account hasn't already been set, which happens sometimes in jobs that are simply past a person that should act as current in that case, then we set it through this overriding of the person accessor. The same thing with the time zone. The time zone is something we record on a person, so people can have their own time zones, and we use it for that. Let's have a look at how this all flows through. First, this is our application controller in Basecamp. It has a lot of concerns mixed into it and zero other code. We factored out every piece of consideration that an application controller, which is really just a root controller for all controllers pretty much in Basecamp 3, what are the things that they all need to do? And all of these considerations can be encapsulated into concerns. We're just going to focus on a couple of these today. We're going to focus on set current request details, and we're going to focus on authenticate. First, if we have a look at set current request details, you see it's a very simple concern. When it's included, it just adds a before action to the application controller and thus to all controllers that inherit from application controller, where we set these globals based off the current request. That now means that anywhere in the application we have access to, within the request cycle, the request ID, which is a unique identifier that we use to tie things through locking and so forth, the user agent, and the IP address. And these are all used for various forms of locking, and I'll show you how this actually ties into our use with current person in just 1 second. That's pretty simple. The one that's not so simple is the authentication concern. So let's look at that here. We authenticate through a bunch of different ways, but the main path we're going to look at right now is cookie authentication, which is basically someone who's logged into the application and then is able to access protected pages by navigating through the application or closing their browser and coming back to the application without clearing their cookies. So the main thing that this routes through, again, this is a concern. It's mixed into application controller, thus all controllers that inherit from application controller gets this logic. The first thing we're going to do here is we're going to authenticate with full authorization. And as you can see here, we have two main paths that we're going to check on when we do that. First, we're going to check on OAuth. That's not the one we're going to focus on right now, so let's leave that aside. And then we're going to check on with cookies. And if this call returns true, then great, we're in. The request is authenticated and things can proceed. If that hasn't happened, and it's not because we've already sort of sent you somewhere else, the OAuth process requires some back and forth, then we're going to request that you supply that API authentication, generally with a head unauthorized response, or we're going to request cookie authentication, which requires kicking you back to a login screen. Cool. Let's have a look at what actually happens in the cookie authentication setup. As you remember over here, when we do authenticate with full authorization, we call this authenticate with cookies, which is provided by this other concern, a concern of a concern, called by cookie. And in here, we're going to do two things. We have two different types of cookies. We have an identity cookie and a remember me cookie. This ties into a shared authentication system that we have for all the application at Basecamp, whether you use Basecamp or Backpack, Highrise, or whatever. We have an identity system that's shared between these things. But let's focus on, actually it doesn't really matter. Let's just focus on the identity cookie here. It's all the same. We have this identity ID that's hidden in a signed cookie, which means that it can't be tampered with on the user side. But we can use it to look up the verified user. And once we've looked that verified user up, we're going to call authenticated user by cookie. Basically, we're going to say how this person was authenticated and set by cookie. This is a shared action, authenticated, that's used whether someone authenticates through cookies or OAuth or whatever. It's kind of the same thing that happens. And as you see here, we record in which way the authentication method happened, whether it was by cookie or whatever. And we basically just use that for logging to say how someone authenticated here. The more interesting point here, the whole reason I'm going through and showing you all this is not an episode about authentication, is this line. That by the time we've gone through this whole authentication path, we end up setting current person to the person of the user that's logging in. And once we have this current person, just as with the request details, that's accessible anywhere in the application to any class at any time. It's a global, right? So what can we use these globals for? And I'm going to show you another concept of Basecamp. It's something I'm going to come back to in another episode and explain in more detail. I'm just going to sort of glance over a bunch of the details here. It's event tracking. And event tracking is a really powerful idea where you basically record the changes that are going on in the system in some other sort of class or some other tracking system than just trying to deduce what the changes were by looking at the objects themselves. The interesting part as it relates to globals here is that event tracking is something that happens as a side effect. In episode 2, I discussed the side effects around callbacks through the implementation of the mentions feature. This is another one of these side effects. It's not one of these concerns. Event tracking is something that's an auxiliary complexity, something that happens on the side, something we don't want to necessarily focus on all the time. So we've implemented this in much the same way that we've implemented the mentions feature. It's a concern, it uses callbacks, and it declares an association. So you can see the structure here is quite similar. And this is really a structure that we use for a lot of the concerns in Basecamp and in all our applications, that you have these encapsulated concepts like mentions, like events. We implement these through concerns, and we mix these concerns into a base class. In this case, the base class is recording. Recording is our sort of master metadata class of all the concrete classes that we have in Basecamp, whether it's messages or to-dos or documents or whatever have you. I'm also going to come back to that setup, recordings and buckets, the idea of using concrete metadata class to sort of encapsulate shared behavior is a really interesting one, and it's probably the most powerful pattern that we have in all of Basecamp. So that's well deserving of a whole episode. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. My apologies. What I want to show you is how we use these globals and why they are so powerful as globals, and it's not something we need to pass around all the time. So let's focus on one flow here out of events, the fact that we track an event every single time a recording is created. We have this general track event method that can be called for any kind of action, whether when something is created or when it's updated or other changes are made. And we have all sorts of changes or all sorts of actions and all sorts of different kinds of events that we track in Basecamp 3, but the primary one, the one that's tracked for pretty much everything, is the creation event. So let's go down to that. We call track created, as you see here, after we've created a recording. We're going to track that recording was created. That basically just calls track event with the status of created. I'm not going to go into the status thing as well. We have an enum that tracks the different kinds of status of a recording. Not really important here. What is important is to sort of flow down here and see what's getting passed on. The fact that when we create this event here, we're passing in the creator not from an action up here, or not from a parameter to track event, but picking it straight out of this global. And the neat thing about that is, as you can see, after create is a callback that doesn't take any variables, right? Like you don't have to pass anything into it to be able to call this. And the reason we don't have to pass anything into it is because we can just pluck this concept, this idea of the current person out of the globals, because that was already set up, and that's incredibly convenient. It would be a real annoyance if when we were creating a new recording we had to specifically pass in, oh, by the way, when you track this event the creator needs to be so and so. Here we can just pluck it out. Well, it gets even better in some cases when you look at the request details. When an event is created, this was what we did in track event. We're basically creating one of these events that tie together a recording that belongs to a bucket and a creator of that event. We also have this idea of the request details. These request details are set in sort of a hash called the detail. And this detail includes a bunch of different things that we want to track around the event. To form a recordable and all sorts of things. But what's interesting here is this requested idea that when we track or when we create an event, we want to know who actually created that event, not just the person who created it, but all those request details that we were setting up in set current request details. These are the things we want to tie to every single event in the system, because it provides a really powerful way of doing basically sort of investigations after the fact. Who changed something, in what circumstances, what was the IP. It provides us through an admin interface for Basecamp to look up who created this thing, simply just through an IP address, which is a really powerful tool for support, especially to try to discern what went wrong if a customer writes in and needs help. In any case, this requested concern basically just says the request has, or an event has a request, and that as we're saving a new request before validation, we'll build this, or as we're saving the event, we'll build this request. And this request basically just plugs out the aspects of the current that we have, the request ID, the user agent, the IP address. And what's interesting here is just how deep in the belly this is. Imagine having to pass this amount of detail, the request ID, user agent, and IP address, all the way from the top of the chain, all the way up from the controller action, down through the creation of a recording, down to through the creation of the event, and so on. It would just be a real hassle. And as I said at the intro, this isn't something you should do for everything. Perhaps there is a temptation that, wouldn't it be easier if you could just stuff something into a global and then you can access it everywhere? And that certainly can be a code smell, that you haven't factored your code correctly and you're using globals as a crutch. In this case, we're using globals as that sharp knife, that this is absolutely something we intend to do, that we've examined the alternatives and said, like, passing this stuff around all the time is actually not an advantage. It doesn't make the code clearer. It makes it more convoluted. And it takes such an auxiliary consideration as being able to look up an event by its request ID and so on, and puts it way too center stage. This is a minor detail that enables us to do one specific thing on call and other forms of investigation. This is not the main thing you should be considered about when you're reading the code of what's going on with event tracking. It's certainly not if you bubble it even up further and what's going on when you create a message, right? Like, you don't want to be bothered with these auxiliary details. So that's basically current. That's the power of current. I think this current implementation is a good guideline, perhaps, to just how much stuff you should shove in there. If you end up with a current that has 10, 15, 20 different things, maybe you're off into the weeds somewhere and you should take a step back and see if there's a different way you can factor your code so that you don't rely on globals so much. But again, globals, sharp knife, really useful for these precision incisions. Use them for that and use them with pride. You shouldn't be ashamed of using globals for these kinds of things, but be mindful of sort of the drawbacks of it as well.